This is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom show, The Wake Up Call on WCOM LP, Chapel Hill in Carrboro, 103.5 on your FM dial, or live streaming at WCOMFM.org. You can also watch the show on the People's Channel after a week's delay on Thursday night at 10 p.m., Friday morning at 6 a.m. or Tuesday at noon. The show will also be available on our YouTube channel, Wilf Wake Up Call. I'm Iris Schwinzer here with our host, Lori Hoy, Chris Carlson on the camera, and today our special guests are Tara Romano and Miriam Thompson.
Thank you, Iris. Tara, we're just so happy to have you back on the show. It's been too long.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and we're good. And Miriam, thank you. Miriam is a Wilf sister who is going to be helping and doing a lot of the interviewing. And we're going to be talking today about women and their reproductive rights and the threat to those rights, which are many right now. And hopefully maybe we can hear about some things that we all can do to help women be able to keep the right to their reproductive system, to their health, to their bodies.
To their families, to their children.
Which affects their families, their children,
That's
and
right.
community, absolutely. So Tara, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And so, I'm not sure where we want to start. So my name is Tara Romano, and I am the director at NARAL Pro-Choice North Carolina. We are a statewide advocacy organization that advocates for a society and for policies that fully support whatever reproductive health decisions people make for themselves. So that includes preventing unplanned pregnancy, so access to contraception. That includes being able to terminate a pregnancy if that's what they want to do, so access to safe and legal abortion. And also supporting people if they want to carry a pregnancy safely to term. So that means being able to have access to healthcare, just general healthcare.
Yeah, and your general health care to keep all of the system going in a healthy condition. There's many things that can affect that, and I just think people get very narrowly focused, and it's a much broader than the one focus that gets in with a lot of controversy, a lot of yelling, without really a lot of thoughtful.
I think people
reflection.
are paying too much attention, also deliberately fear-driven on
Yeah.
abortion, when in fact it is about health care and women's choice. And I also want to elevate the conversation a little bit, because this is clearly, which Tara is now going to describe, a war against women. And the stuff that's going on around the country, the Supreme Court, states that are restricting access. And I remember a wonderful Planned Parenthood, a sister organization they had years ago, in which they showed a picture of choice, and it was a healthy family. That's what choice is all about. So.
Well, so I'm not sure where we want to start.
How about the Roe v. Wade?
Okay, so let's start with the Supreme Court. So actually today, January 22nd, is the 47th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, which was a landmark court decision that it said that abortion needed to be safe and legal in every state in this country. And I think that that's an important thing to help people understand. Roe v. Wade did not introduce American women to abortion. People have been accessing abortion care ever since people have been getting pregnant. And so what this was saying was, it was just sort of recognizing, the court recognized that this was a common experience for women in America, and that they needed access to safe and legal abortion care. So that's what the Roe v. Wade decision did. And it was a pretty simple decision, in that it said these are private personal decisions that people can make for themselves, and that the state really cannot interfere pre-viability. And viability has like a medical definition to a certain extent, but it's also something that is kind of flexible in terms of there are some pregnancies that will never be viable. And so when the Supreme Court said that the states really could not ban abortion outright prior to pre-viability, which is usually about 24 weeks, they also said, and that this determination about viability sometimes is also up to the doctor as well, because they depend on what's going on with the pregnancy. But basically it said that the states were not able to just arbitrarily ban abortion. And so that was the 1973 Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade. And then you go to 1992, I think, which is KCV, Planned Parenthood, which basically set the undue burden standard, which said that states can have an interest in restricting access to abortion, but it can't place an undue burden on the person trying to seek out the abortion. And undue burden has been rather murky in how it's been defined. And so, actually since 2010, which there's a lot of things that happened in 2010 in terms of how elections went, but that's where we've really seen just sort of an onslaught of restrictions around at the state level that have really impacted people's ability to access abortion. I do want to mention, so Roe v. Wade set the standard that abortion needed to be safe and legal, but they didn't really set the standard that it should be accessible. And 3 years after Roe v. Wade in 1976, Senator Henry Hyde of Illinois, very much an opponent of abortion, and so he introduced what is called the Hyde Amendment, which said that if you use Medicaid, which is what a lot of low-income patients use to get access to healthcare, you could not get abortion covered, except in very rare instances, as in terms of rape and incest or threat to the life or health of the pregnant person. And even those restrictions or those exceptions actually have been hard in practice to use. So basically, and Senator or Representative Hyde, I believe, was really clear. Like he said, I would ban all abortion if I could, but I can't. So what I'm going to do is make sure poor people can't access it. And so the Hyde Amendment is not law. It is something that is voted on every year in the budget. But it's something that has been reauthorized again and again and again. And so right from 1960.
By the way, even when the Democrats controlled Congress.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there actually is a narrative that one of our challenges is that we are really pushing up against a narrative of 40 plus years, almost 50 years of a lot of anti-abortion misinformation and manipulation around emotions and those types of things. But there is this idea that people don't support tax dollars paying for abortion. And I think if you ask that question generally, people who don't understand might say, yes, that makes sense. But then when you explain to them how that works out in practice, like the Hyde Amendment, people using military insurance, people who work for the federal government in North Carolina, people who work for the state, can't access abortion care just because somebody, and that's the only type of care that is restricted in that way. People actually, in my experience, don't seem to think that is fair. And I think that when you explain it as a fairness and a discrimination issue, people really start to understand, like, basically what you're then setting up what we had prior to Roe v. Wade, which is a two-tier healthcare system. If you had access to money, you could access abortion, even if it was illegal. But if you were a poor person who did not have access to resources, you could not access abortion. And we're really, honestly, people opposed to abortion ever since the 1973 ruling have been struggling to reset up that system, where if you have means, you can always access abortion. If you're desperate, you're going to have to go to underground networks, and who knows how that will turn out for you.
I want people to really, and you're drawing the intersection, because the attack on poor and low wealth is all over the country.
Right.
So this is elevates it really to public consciousness in a very visceral way, but it's part of the economic disparity that's pervasive throughout the country.
And it's something that, you really, when you talk about like how these things intersect, like you've also got this degradation of the safety net here, which has always been a struggle in this country, but also really, again, since 2010, in North Carolina, for sure, they've been absolutely tearing apart the safety net. So you've got people who can't access family planning, including contraception and abortion. They cut off funds to Planned Parenthood, which is a safety net provider for a lot of low-income folks in North Carolina. But then you also have them, they don't like it when people who don't have money have children either, right? So they're cutting off access, they're underfunding public ed, they're cutting off access. There certainly is still not really good affordable childcare in North Carolina. Probably since 2010, they cut unemployment benefits, they have cut the food stamps at the federal level. North Carolina has joined in that. North Carolina is still, might be the only state that got rid of the state earned income tax credit, which was a huge boost for low-income women in particular raising families. So you've got a lot of different ways that they are just telling people who don't have that means that we don't want you to do anything, you know?
I mean, that's the part, the hypocrisy,
For sure.
that is maddening.
Mhm.
I mean, I can understand, may not agree with
Mhm.
somebody having this really strict moral thing that they think it goes, you know, of course, the old saying is, if you don't like abortion, don't get
Right.
one. But aside from that, but the hypocrisy in doing everything to prevent, especially poorer people, economically poorer people, from being able to get an abortion as a form of family planning when, and the stakes happen, we do not have a good medical devices that really work all the time in terms of prevention. So it's just very easy for somebody to get pregnant who may not want to. And then to when they have these children, to do everything. I mean, even in here in this state, I think 1 in 4 children is food insufficient.
Right.
And that's a nationwide thing that's going on. I mean, all of the things you mentioned where we don't take care of young people, we don't provide childcare, we want these poor women to go to work, but who's gonna take care of their
Making barely the
children?
minimum wage and can't support their families.
Yeah, and expect them to somehow find some magician to take care of their kids. I remember not too many years back where a mother had to go to work and she left an older child in charge of 3 or 4 little ones. And I think they couldn't afford the heat. There was a candle and there was a fire where many of the children perished. And they just, you know, the public outcry of it, this terrible woman, I think she left an 11 or 12-year-old in charge.
She was desperate.
She's desperate, you know, to go to work, and who's gonna take care of her kids? And who would do it for free or for money at night? So, I mean, they put women, all women, but particularly poor women, in the catch-22. There's no way you're going to be able to win. It's just unconscionable.
I wanna just, and you can talk about this in conclusion, but this is what people can do. These are the stories that people should be telling. It isn't just the statistics.
Yes.
It's what happens
It's the stories.
to women who are struggling to support their families, whether they're single moms or they're married. You know, the kind of story that Lori's telling. And I think we have to really encourage people to tell more of those stories when they talk about this war on women and attack on Roe that's upcoming, and attack on women's reproductive rights and healthcare.
And definitely, I think abortion for sure is very stigmatized. And that's really, I think, by design from people opposed to abortion. Like, they want to keep people silenced about it, because they do know when people hear stories, people have empathy. And people can relate to a lot of those stories. And so, and also there's like, what's very stigmatized even around pregnancy and childbirth, when people have either like a difficult pregnancy, or maybe childbirth was challenging. Like, women in particular are made to feel really ashamed if things aren't perfect, if they're not. And we also really in our society like to be very judgmental of women in particular. And I also want to mention, you know, we recognize that trans people and people who do not conform to the gender binary also are able to get pregnant as well. Anybody who has a uterus. And like, when it comes to pregnancy and how it relates to the feminine and women, like, there's just so much judgment, and people feel free actually to do public judgments, right? Like, when somebody is pregnant and somebody says, should you be eating that, you know, and they don't even know that person, you know, or will judge how they're doing things, and certainly judging people for getting an abortion, judging people for using birth control, judging people for having sex outside of marriage.
But they're not judging against economic disparity on the minimum wage,
Right.
on a failure for a living wage that will allow that kind of judgment they're not getting.
Yeah.
And they're encouraged. You know, we have an administration that really encourages fear and hate and exclusion and discrimination. So we have we have to make a stronger footprint, which will.
And what I wanted to mention was, because these things are so stigmatized, that silence, like, people will fill that silence with some sort of narrative. And that's really what the anti-abortion folks have been doing. When people don't talk about, like, abortion is a common experience. You know, I think about 1 in 4 American women access abortion during their lifetimes. But they either, and people don't have to talk about their medical histories. Like, that's not something that they should have to do. But also, they've been very stigmatized. They don't, like, I listen to a lot of abortion stories, and people tell me a lot of their stories, and they tell me about their miscarriage stories and their pregnancy stories. But they're not always, they do that when they feel like they can trust you, that you're not going to judge them. And a lot of people will say when they're telling their story, like, I didn't even tell my family because I was afraid that how they might react. And so you've got like this silence around abortion, and so the anti-abortion folks fill it with a narrative that is misleading, it's manipulative, and it's often a lot of false narratives. And so then you have these stereotypes that even people who are supportive of abortion access still like will believe things that are not true about it. I remember once we were talking about abortion later in pregnancy, which is a very small, like maybe about 1 or 2% of abortion care. And somebody's like, oh yeah, that's 40% of abortion. And I'm like, no, that is not true, but it's because of the narratives that are put out there.
I missed what did they say?
They said it was 40%. And like, it's just, and of course the vast majority of abortion happens prior to 12 weeks. But also like, just putting out these stories, like there's just a lot of stories. And I think one of the things that people can do, that can be empowering. It doesn't have to, like, certainly if people want to share those stories, we want to help people do that. And there's been things like Shout Your Abortion, and We Testify from National Network of Abortion Funds that is helping people put out their stories. And you have a younger generation of people who feel more comfortable doing that. But also talking to people in your life about why you support abortion access. Because one thing I remember some time ago, my parents were going, like my parents are retired, but they were going to some event where my mom used to work, and my mom says to my dad, well, no, don't bring up abortion because some people there are opposed to abortion. So of course my dad brings it up, and I'm like, well, good for you, because like we know how they feel, because clearly they've said it at some point they're opposed to abortion, but then they don't even want us to have a conversation with them, to like challenge them about it, and that works in their favor. Like you don't have to have a screaming fight. But we have to have discussions, and I actually have seen people sit in a room together and actually be able to have a safe and nuanced discussion about abortion and really come out, I think, being a lot more comfortable with their support because they've been given the opportunity to talk about it. They hear people's stories instead of just this like, oh, I'm not sure what to think, and I'm afraid people will start yelling. It's like, no.
Would you,
Yeah.
I just want to ask a question. Would you start with abortion as opposed to starting with the importance of women's right to health care, to support their families, and then bring up all the various ways in which women may have to make very critical decisions? I'm not sure, in some circles, maybe you can start with abortion, but in some circles, especially when you said safe space, talk about really the larger context in which this is a piece of healthcare, but there's a much broader healthcare message.
And I'm struck by what you're saying about people feeling, even if they're pro-abortion, feeling sort of shamed to bring it up, or who you say it to and whatever.
Yeah, make it
but I'm
safe.
thinking about the shame for women. So much of their bodily functions.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, and I'm not that old, you could not say, it was not polite to say a woman was pregnant.
Oh.
She was in, and at one point, and I was shocked, I didn't realize that, I was young, a teenager, and I was in the kitchen with my mother and a girlfriend, and I said something about somebody we knew, I think we were seniors. Somebody was pregnant, and my mother hit me, which she rarely did, but I think she was feeling that I was doing something in front of somebody else that was shaming the family or something. You should never say that. And I said, and I was shocked. I said, what should I say? They're in the family way. And so this is working class, and this is 51. But so it's not that far back in history, but and I'm sure some other people who maybe were more in a different class maybe would be a little cooler about it. But this was not unusual. There were things, we still wore white gloves in.
I think it continues. There may be different conversations
Yes.
and context.
That's my point, that in women's all of
The
our bodily
discomfort
processes
continues.
are to men, they're not quite sure whether it's menstruation
Yeah.
or period, whatever it is, it's something that's to be hidden and it's not to be talked about in polite company, and definitely not. So this is all part of that, I think, the shaming of women.
It's also, the burden is only on women,
Yeah,
not those who impregnate women.
yeah,
You know, there is two
yes, yes.
different forces involved in this.
And that's where I think a lot of opposition to the full range of reproductive health care, which includes abortion, contraception, prenatal care, postpartum care, is rooted in misogyny. It's this idea, I mean, it's just, like saying that, you can't say somebody is pregnant. And like, honestly, I do feel like there are elected officials who will make, and we've seen more of this, who will introduce regulations around abortion and talk about a specific medical procedure that clearly is not actually an accurate medical, it's not a procedure, it's not accurate medical information, but not really knowing, really. And that's part of like not talking about pregnancy either. Like there's, you will hear, I think often somebody will say, well, if you don't want to have the child, like just go ahead and give it up for adoption. But like not like sort of separating completely, like being pregnant is also part of your body and it has an impact on you. Some people have very easy pregnancies. Some people have challenging pregnancies. I know people who've had to be on pretty intensive bed rest. And so that's like, there are just, it's just sort of, it's like divorced almost from like the healthcare aspect and the fact that it is actually doing something different, whether or not it's easy or you're fine with it, like it still is impacting your body. But there's so much ignorance, and I'm not saying ignorance in a pejorative way, but like just people not knowing like any of that stuff.
Can you describe the resistance efforts that are underway, to put pressure, to be present when the Supreme Court, and it will, deal with the Roe v. Wade, which is very scary because of the composition of the court, but also what's happening on the state level.
Sure.
And so if you could describe it. And don't forget to talk about your presentation as a policy watch lunch.
I will make sure to do that. And so I do want to mention March 4th is the day that the Supreme Court is taking up an abortion rights case. And it's the first one they've taken up since Justice Brett Kavanaugh was put on the court in 2018. And so, putting Kavanaugh on the court along with Gorsuch, those are both Trump appointees, really solidly put the court tilted towards anti-abortion. And these are people who appear ideologically opposed to abortion. So that's a 5-4 anti-abortion majority they've got there, and honestly put on the court by a president who promised, like one of his campaign promises was to get rid of Roe v. Wade. Now, let
alone Obama's, let alone the health care.
Right.
Interesting, both.
And so March 4th, they're going to be taking up a case that is coming out of Louisiana, and it's about admitting privileges, which is, it's called Targeted Regulation of Abortion Providers, CHAP laws. And it's targeting abortion providers with medically unsound regulations that make it hard for them to meet those standards, and then they end up having to close down clinics. And Louisiana already, I think, only has 3 clinics. And I think if this law went into effect, it would have 1 clinic and I think just 1 medical provider for the whole state. The thing about this law, them taking it up sends a bad message in the first place, the Supreme Court taking it up, because this law is identical, this regulation is identical to what was struck down in Texas in 2016, Whole Women's Health versus Hellerstedt, which was where the court upheld that you can't put arbitrary restrictions on abortion, and it struck down this very same law. And now, so really what the Supreme Court should have said was, we just decided that in 2016, Louisiana, and no, it's unconstitutional. But instead, the Supreme Court said, tell me more, Louisiana. So the fact that they're taking it up makes us feel, and it's hard to say what the Supreme Court's going to do, and I don't think anyone can ever really foretell the future, but I do feel like with the makeup of the court, with all the promises that have been made, and the fact that they've taken up a case that would essentially is having them ignore precedent of just 3 years ago, we don't necessarily feel great about what's going to happen. And they've also added, Louisiana has added a piece saying that because typically it has been abortion providers who have been the people who bring these cases to court, having standing, saying I'm impacted by this law. Of course, pregnant people who are accessing abortion are also impacted by these laws. It's hard for them to bring those cases to court. And what Louisiana has now is also challenging is that abortion providers, doctors, do not have standing, which and it
They're
may,
also threatened.
yeah.
I mean, abortion doctors have been
So
murdered.
they're saying that, they don't have standing,
It's so somebody called it a Hail Mary pass from Louisiana Justice Center there, or the justice system there, about like trying to just sort of then get rid of the ability of doctors to bring these suits, and then which would basically, and it sort of goes to this idea. I've heard it in so many different ways. It's like, well, if it really harms you, you can bring a suit, right? Like, so a pregnant person, like, who's trying to seek an abortion, the idea is that they somehow would be able to bring a lawsuit against the whole state, against the law. So it's
Further exposing
yeah.
them. And you're,
well, I was just gonna say, and the Supreme Court now, of course, we're all a little worried about it.
For sure.
Our president has had, how many has he been able to get
Two.
on?
Two, yeah.
And already the court was pretty divided
Right.
and barely
Mhm.
able to have the liberals to get through. I think Kennedy was the.
He was he
He
has
could
said a
go
lot
either
of problematic
way, but-
decisions.
Yeah,
but,
he
yeah.
was like the fulcrum there.
Yeah.
Where,
Mhm.
okay, and how many of them are Catholic now? I think
It's definitely a majority.
the majority are
there's-
Catholic,
yeah.
which I think, in a way, you should say that the Supreme Court really can't make a decision that their church. I mean, now I wonder if somebody could raise that they're.
Well, I mean,
They
I
have.
would say I think Justice Sotomayor is Catholic, and we don't necessarily think of her as
That's
being
true.
a reliable anti-abortion vote. And I do want to mention that, I grew up Catholic.
Me too.
And so, the majority of Catholics, lay Catholics, do support abortion access. They support access to birth control. Their leadership does not. So really, you have like
The
an
bishops.
institution that is not representing what its constituents think. But they have very much outsized influence in terms of particularly the Supreme Court. But I do think it's a shame that, and I do think some of those people put on the court who are anti-abortion were chosen. Like, they're Catholic, they're anti-abortion.
Absolutely, yeah.
Assuming that, I mean, I think Justice O'Connor may have been Catholic as well, but she certainly didn't turn out to be the reliable anti-abortion vote that they may have thought she was. But what we have is people who are like very ideologically opposed to abortion take out this case, and so, like I said, we're not sure. There's a couple of different ways the case may turn out. We won't hear probably till the end of June, but it could be that they just decide that the fetus is also protected in the Constitution, which would then outlaw abortion across the country. Like, it really wouldn't even go back to the states. They would just say the fetus has the same rights as the pregnant person, so then abortion would be outlawed. I don't know if that'll happen. Honestly, I have no idea. I mean, I think that that's kind of an outlier, so I don't want to be fear-mongering about that. But I'm just putting it
That's sort of one of the worst case scenarios.
Right.
the real threat, however, whatever the Supreme Court
Yeah.
decision, if it doesn't derail what the states are doing, and I think you might
Yeah.
want to talk about that.
Right.
Because the states' restrictions now are even more dangerous.
Okay, we're gonna take a station break right now, catch your breath, marshal your thoughts.
This is Wilf's Wake Up Call on WCOMLP, Chapel Hill and Carver, 103.5 FM. You can stream us live at WCOMF.org. Today our guests are Tara Romano and Miriam Thompson.
We have at least
Uh,
one.
A reminder that CHOPE, the Chapel Hill Organization for Clean Energy, is having its meeting on Tuesday night, January 28th at the Chapel Hill Public Library from 6:30 to 8.
Thank you. Okay, back to our guests. We have Tara Romano from ARAL and Miriam Thompson from WILF and NAACP and many other organizations, the Abrahamic Initiative
On the Middle East,
for the Middle East and Jewish Voices for Peace. So we are having a discussion which is a really, one of the most important ones for all of us, but especially for women, on women's reproductive rights and women's health in general, which affects the family
Absolutely.
and the community and all of us. So, Tara.
And so, as Miriam mentioned, like there's other possibilities of what might happen on March 4th. And one could be like, and like I said before, like Roe v. Wade was certainly never really fulfilled the promise of reproductive freedom because it didn't address the fact that people need to be able to access it if a right is to have meaning. But it did make it is still important that it established that this should be safe and legal because it is a common procedure that people need to access. So another way that they could impact it would be to sort of really kind of overrule it, say that, you know, the right to privacy, which is what it was said to be ruled on in the first place in 1973, is actually not appropriate. And so if they overrule it, what it means is they'll go back to the states like it was prior to 1973. And there are a lot of states, there are a number of states that already have like what is called a trigger law, that says if Roe v. Wade is overturned, abortion is automatically banned in the state. Now, North Carolina is
Or automatically what?
banned in the state.
Okay.
North Carolina does not have a trigger law. It does not actually even have like an old law on the books that says abortion is illegal. North Carolina actually, prior to Roe, legalized some forms of abortion.
Did what?
Legalized some forms of abortion. Prior, and like I think it was like 1968. Well, they said, you know, in the case of rape and incest and the threat of health to the life or health of the pregnant person.
Yes, they did
Yeah.
have that, and that if your doctor and the family and some, I think you had 3 people agreeing that it was important, but it could be even for the
Yeah.
person's mental
Mhm.
health or emotional health, that it could be done in the hospital, it could be
Or
done
physical
in the
health.
Right, and so that would be throwing it back to the states. And so that is where, and of course, I mean, I do feel like that's where a lot of people who are supportive of this current federal administration are wanting to see, right? They want to see Roe overturned. And of course they wouldn't stop there either. Like the idea, because I do think that there are some certain like so-called blue states that like New York and Massachusetts and Oregon and Washington who are really shoring up abortion access, like either putting it in the Constitution or having state protections. North Carolina of course doesn't have that. But I think the idea, like, and that would be something at first at least, but the idea that anti-abortion folks, if they had the power, would stop with it being back to the states, I think we can't count on that. Like, they would certainly then try their best to get Congress to just do, like, a federal law saying that you can't have abortion.
And just remember,
yeah.
they're closing clinics now.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that women, especially poor and low wealth, don't have access
Right.
now, and they can't afford it. And remember, the Hyde Amendment still is on
Yeah.
the books. So at some point, you wanna talk about how we're trying to raise money to help women access
Yes.
abortion where it's available.
And so, and then that leads to like what another possible decision might be in a March 4th case, which is just really taking the undue burden standard and making it murkier and really saying that states can actually put pretty intense restrictions and they don't have to, like, it doesn't matter that Texas law was ruled unconstitutional because Louisiana says actually it's okay, and like having this real patchwork of states and allowing states to really put pretty heavy burdens on access to abortion. And like there are a number of states that only have 1 clinic. Like Missouri is one of those states. I think South Dakota maybe has 1 clinic. Like I said, Louisiana has 3. You know, like we've got these abortion bans that have been stayed by the courts, but they're still out there. Like Alabama had a total abortion ban. Other places, like Missouri, was 8 weeks. Other places are doing like 6 weeks, 15 weeks. And so what you have is the challenge, of course, is if you really let it go back to the states, or if you just make it so that it's become so inaccessible and that states are allowed to restrict it however they want, you have people leaving the state trying to access abortion care. People are not going to stop trying to access abortion care because they accessed it before it was legal. That's just been the way around the world. Like you see in countries where it is completely illegal, people still access care, and what happens is people are harmed when accessing care.
Well, in some countries, it's illegal, but it's not pay very much attention to, and doctors, you can go and get an abortion. You just don't advertise it.
Women are dying here and abroad because of lack of access. They are dying.
Oh, absolutely.
In fact,
I'm just saying that in some countries,
yeah,
it's like
they
a
don't-
de
they don't
facto law that's
enforce
not
it.
paid attention to.
Right.
In other countries, it's just even more vicious than our country is becoming in terms of.
In most
how they
countries
handle
run
women.
by autocrats and dictators and so
Yeah,
on. It's,
yeah.
it's hideous. But also, I should mention that we've withdrawn aid. You know, I can't remember what it's called, Amanda Murray, her,
Oh, with the global gag rule.
right, you want to talk about that?
Yes, and this is where you see like anti-abortion politics. I mean, they're always really played out on the backs of
For women.
and you see that again globally as well, where you have people who have no say in who our president is, being impacted by with the whatever switch of a
Stroke of a
pen.
pen.
Yeah, stroke of a pen, signing an executive order called the Global Gag Rule, which was from Mexico City, I think in the 1960s, maybe 1960s. I cannot remember when it was. But it basically said that if you're getting family planning money from the United States as aid money, which is really important to a lot of these countries who need that access, those resources that have really been probably stolen from them with our capitalist system, but need those resources to help them, but you can't talk about abortion. And if you even talk about abortion or refer to abortion, they won't give you the money. Which really ties the hands of some of these agencies. Some agencies just won't accept the money.
And people may want to know, it's our country, and they're very much supported by Saudi Arabia, which we know how they treat their women, and also the Vatican. There's this little group of misogynistic men who are making these rules that are affecting women all over the world.
The gag rule is Trump's, is that right?
Well, that's been in place since Ronald Reagan, I believe. And so what happened is it's an executive order, so a president who comes in who supports abortion access repeals it. And then a president who comes in who wants to restrict abortion access signs off on it again. So it's just really playing havoc with people's lives. I mean, because that's what we're talking about. Like, and then of course, under this current president, he expanded what money was impacted by that. So prior to 2016, it had to do with like family planning money specifically, but his administration expanded to be like any global health money. So if you have money to deal with diabetes, to deal with any other kind of health issues, and somehow you are connected to family planning programs or talking about abortion, like your funding could be threatened. So it definitely was an expansion of that. And so I want to get back to what Miriam was saying about how people cannot even really access abortion. There's so many barriers, and one of the things I want to talk about is when clinics close, or when they're clustered. Like in North Carolina, there are a decent number of clinics for a southeastern state, but they're clustered in 9 counties, right? They're clustered where the urban areas are. There's one out in Asheville, there is one in Wilmington, and then there's a whole lot of counties in between. There's Charlotte, Triangle Triad, and then there's Fayetteville. But then there's a whole lot of space in between where people have to travel, and like that right there is a barrier. I remember hearing a story of somebody they were able to like give this person, it was an abortion fund, and they were able to give this person the money they need to cover the procedure and get transportation to the clinic, but they were having a hard time getting the person like to where they could get the bus, just to get from their rural town, like because they didn't have any transportation. And that's real, that's what happens. People, not everyone has easy access to transportation, and you have people making these laws or debating these laws who just don't have that lived experience, and so they can't fathom like what it means to not have a car or to have reliable transportation, or to think, well, it's it's a 2-hour drive, that's not a big deal. I'm like, it's 4 hours at least of transportation that day, and so that right there blocks people from being able to access abortion or any kind of healthcare, really, any kind of reproductive healthcare. I mean, we have rural hospitals closing around the state. North Carolina is one of the few remaining states that has not expanded Medicaid. Had a couple of rural hospitals close, and actually, even if the hospital didn't close, they closed the labor and delivery unit because it didn't make the labor and delivery unit because they quote unquote don't make money. But presumably, people are having babies in those counties, and actually, a quarter of the counties in North Carolina do not have a practicing OBGYN. And again, people are still having babies, having pregnancies in those counties, and they have to travel. And I think a lot of people think it's not a big deal to have to travel 30, 45 minutes for an appointment. I'm like, it is a big deal. Like, people actually don't want to be doing that. You know, especially if you already have children, you maybe don't have
Childcare,
yeah, it's not
job.
easy to get time off of work. You don't have access to reliable transportation. You don't have the money for gas. Like, there are a lot of things going on that makes it really challenging that we have a healthcare system that is so broken. And reproductive healthcare in particular has been really marginalized for, honestly, that men who are empowered, just because they don't need to access it, they think it's not important.
Well, and that since so many people are so worried about where their tax money goes, our tax money is going into the whole Medicare system where we're helping, or some of our tax money is helping other people in Medicare expansion that we're not having in this state. So we're putting money into
You
a
mean
system.
Medicaid?
Medicaid thank you. Medicaid expansion. And I think there's a letter to the editor in today or yesterday's paper about that. You know, so, I mean, this, in the broader context, this, if you look at women's health in the context of our health care system, particularly in these rural areas, or there's such a lack of health care anyhow,
Right.
such a lot, particularly if we're talking about reproduction, about childbirth, about our babies being born, and we don't have a very good record on how many live births we have. So it's all part of that whole system, and yet people narrow down and get absolutely saliva coming out of their mouth with fury about one part of it and just totally ignore all
And then
of it.
they make sure that you don't have the vote to really overturn
Yes,
some of
and
these
they press the
policies.
vote.
So this is all about power, both over women, over the vote, over
And
the
particularly
economy.
about,
Oh,
and when you
It's all
look at how
connected.
many men, these protests, there are a few women, but it's so many men out there protesting about abortion or about things for women. And it's, every time I see that, I just cringe with, like fury, trying to restrain myself. It's infuriating.
And
well, we need to start thinking about it, maybe you can talk about. These are some of the leaders in the House and the
Yes.
Senate and in the federal government that we need to make sure vacate their offices and we get rid of them. So I wanted you to start talking about what kind of resistance efforts, and please don't fail to mention in your presentation at the North Carolina Policy Watch.
thank
This is
you,
really
and thank you,
exciting.
Miriam, for keeping me on topic. I do briefly want to mention, like, another issue we've been seeing is escalation of harassment at clinics.
Of
What?
Harassment at clinics. People protesting outside of clinics, and that has really escalated. And what we're seeing is an emboldened opposition, and they, I mean, it's just like, yeah, people have a First Amendment right to protest, and we are not ever trying to challenge that. But there is, like, you see a lot, particularly folks who are out there every day protesting, like, there gets to be, like, a very fine line between protest and harassment, and we're seeing people stepping over that line.
And harassment gets to be a fine line also with bullying.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to
Intimidation, you bet.
protest and you have your rights, First Amendment rights, but when you see the pictures of them screaming and yelling at some frightened woman trying to get through this line to get into the door for the help that she needs, it is sickening. It is really sickening.
It's, they will be emotionally manipulative, they will do fear mongering, and even just straight up harassment, like filming people, like everyone with phones now, like they will film people, film clinic volunteers, film clinic staff as a way of intimidation, and just really say terrible things. And I think, and I just feel like they just feel really emboldened. And since 2016, I do think, like, prior to 2016, the election, you did see the anti-abortion movement putting up more women, white women in particular, as, well, we can't be anti-women because we have women speaking out against abortion. But since the 2016 election, because of the misogyny coming out of the White House, like, I think that they have just not bothered with that. Like, it's just, you see a lot of men standing up there leading these protests, speaking out, being the ones that they feel that need to speak out. And so I want to then go back to, like, the redistricting and the voting, because I do feel like I mean, I talk to a lot of people about abortion. I see data and polling, and we've seen as there have been more intense attacks on abortion access that the majority of Americans, they may have conflicted feelings, but they ultimately come down on the side of safe and legal abortion access because they know they can't make that decision for other people, and that's all we're asking. So what you see though is like our General Assembly, like that's not reflected in our General Assembly at all, because we have a lot of the people there are very hostile. They have the majority in the General Assembly, but they don't represent the majority view in North Carolina, and that has to do with redistricting, right? That has to do with like trying to consolidate power, and using abortion is a wedge issue. Like it absolutely is a way to get people upset and emotional, and then they might then vote for people who otherwise they might say, hey, why are you not supporting minimum wage, raising the minimum wage, or why are you taking money from my tax dollars and giving it to corporations? But instead they'll get them upset about like abortion and LGBTQ equality, the ERA, and then they'll go ahead and do a lot of things.
Certain issues that they can just.
So what is our response? That is a very devious, I mean, what can we do? I mean, we can bring these up at candidate forums. We've got to be out back in the clinics and supporting the people who come to clinics for healthcare, as well as the staff and the doctors.
Well, I definitely think with candidate forums coming up, I mean, asking the question, like, not just do you support Roe v. Wade, because I think it's deeper than that. Like, we need people to, like, support, like, what it means to actually make sure people can get access to the care they need. And that doesn't mean just because they live in a certain place where there's a clinic they can access it, or they have certain types of insurance they can access it, but like, what are you going to do to make sure people have equitable access to the reproductive health care they need? Because right now, like also the White House has asked the Supreme Court to look again at the birth control mandate with the ACA, to revisit that. Can employers really
The affordability
say,
Obamacare.
Can employers actually not cover birth control if it goes against not just their religious beliefs but their moral beliefs? And they really are pushing that. They're leaning hard into that. They want employers to be able to say, nope, I'm not going to cover birth control. So you've got, like, it goes deeper than just saying, yes, I support Roe v. Wade or I support access to legal abortion. Like, but what are you going to do to make sure people have the care they need?
But, I mean, and that even shows that this is such a power thing about women's bodies. You know, it's not just abortion. If you get even into birth control, then it's just showing we're going to determine if you're in a marriage that has a normal relationship, that how many kids you have, or you know, can you have them or not have them, and you can't talk about spacing or family planning, and I think I remember even the Pope said, well, even as Catholics we're not talking about acting like rabbits or something, you know, he made some remark about having child after child, which some took to mean like an implicit understanding of some sort of birth control, whichever it might be. It might be some other method than I think there's something to be said for they do the rhythm a little more scientifically now with temperature or whatever, but giving his what he's saying is that yes, you should have some sort of family planning. You shouldn't just be having child after child, and yet they're doing everything they can to prevent that from any kind of information where you can plan your family.
I want to ask Tara, does NARAL have a quick blurb that it can send out that we can put on our Facebook page?
Sure.
We can put on social media, you should talk about that. We can write letters to the editor, we can have conversations with our friends and allies to make sure they bring these issues up at upcoming candidates forums. Write to the candidates and really ask them, and put it in the context of justice. You know, this is and the kind of war against women that's affecting
justice
families.
and women's overall health, you know, and the health of their family
and their lives, right? They're you know, people really are empathetic to, you know. I recently was sitting with a group of young people and we were talking about abortion and just like, you know, I was asking, like, write down reasons, like, discuss amongst yourself why some people might choose abortion. And they were talking about, like, oh, somebody hasn't finished college, or, you know, like, all kinds of reasons, or maybe, you know, their parents, you know, like like there's so many things, right? And so, but they weren't saying things like, oh, they're just selfish and hate kids, which is like really what the anti-abortion movement wants you to think.
The question is to get the young and the millennials to vote
Well, I think, yeah, and voting is going to be key. And
and
you
run for
mentioned,
office.
yes, and running for office and taking back power where we can. And I think there's also power of grassroots movements. And you mentioned about raising your voice, letters to the editor op-eds. Like, I think between now, January 22nd, the anniversary row, and March 4th, which is the Supreme Court, when they're going to hear oral arguments in this anti-abortion case, people should be writing. Just like talking about, why do I support abortion access? This is why it's important to me. And people have all kinds of reasons. But to really get it out there, because it will help, I mean, lawmakers read the opinion pages. And I don't think the media needs to also understand better ways to talk about abortion access.
Yes.
That's right.
That's,
You know, and I mean, I appreciate what they try doing. I certainly have talked to some very good journalists who are trying hard to present the different sides, but I feel like they also like are promoting a status quo narrative as well. You know, whenever they say people are evenly divided about abortion, I'm like, that's not really true.
Yeah.
But it's certainly an anti-abortion talking point. And then, you know, not really sort of examining like what does it mean to have a 72-hour waiting period like we do in North Carolina. Okay, so I know we're coming up towards the end, and I wanted to make sure to address some things about, like, yes, people need to vote. They need to raise their voices. Again, I mean, even just talking to people in your own circles about why you support abortion access, I think can really go a long way to help people feel comfortable talking about all of these things, taking away that stigma. Because the stigma really lends itself to how they can get away with putting out these restrictions. I mean, one thing I've seen with groups of people and seen in data is that people, when they hear about a restriction, like on its own, they're like, oh, well, that sounds reasonable. But when they see it like listed as a part of like a whole movement of trying to restrict access, then they are upset because they realize people are not able to access abortion, and that's like the idea behind it, and that there's hypocrisy behind it, that there are people trying to consolidate their own power, they may not really care about it. I mean, there's definitely also this idea people have, which is not untrue, is that people putting these restrictions into place, like, will still manage to figure out how they or their loved one can get an abortion if needed, right?
and I think a really powerful thing that you just reminded us about, which I didn't realize, that this is coming up before the Supreme Court on March 4th. And I think to let people know that, you know, you may think, oh, one of these days I'm going to do something about that or write a letter.
Yeah, it's
This
a good
is
time.
an impending thing.
Yeah.
This is the time to put that on your agenda. There's so many things
Yeah, for sure.
that are on people's minds and worries and concerns right now. But I think with having that date as a deadline, I think that's a really important thing as we're talking with people to bring that up. Did you know that this is coming before this Trump Supreme Court right now?
Right.
The same court, by the way, that upheld gerrymandering
Right,
and voter suppression.
right.
So
Yeah.
this is a big part.
This is a big thing,
This
and
is
that
part of the
anything can
general-
happen, and this is the time to get in touch, and if you wanna make phone calls or write letters, this is the time, and I think emphasizing that piece of time, I think is gonna be an important part in talking to people.
I would also emphasize how important it is to put it in context of the economic war, not only against health war against women, but it's against workers, you know, it's against the
Families, yeah.
raising the minimum wage.
Right.
This is all about
Part of the
really an
context.
unjust
But, okay, just
political
wanna say
climate.
we've got about 2 more minutes.
Okay.
if that's
So
okay.
what I'm going to mention is we are going to delve deeper into the Supreme Court case on January 28th. NC Policy Watch is hosting a crucial conversation in Raleigh. You can go to their website, where NC Policy Watch, and register for it. It's going to be at the Junior League in Raleigh, and it's myself and Kendra Johnson from Equality NC, because there's also, this past fall, they heard a really important case around the rights of trans people, workers, and really it basically is like, can they just be fired for being trans? And unfortunately, we're worried that might be what the case comes down from the court in the ruling. So Kendra Johnson from Equality NC is going to talk about that with me. So we're going to delve more deeply into like what this Supreme Court session might mean for different kinds of rights, like abortion rights and civil rights. And then
So that'll be
NC.
January 28th.
Yes, Tuesday.
North Carolina Policy Watch.
Yeah.
It's
We'll put it on the Wilf website
we'll put it on,
Mhm.
and if people are
Facebook.
interested who don't go to Wilf, how would they get in touch? Go to NC Policy?
Yes.
ncpolicywatch.org.
And what
Yeah.
time is it at?
It's at noon. It's at lunchtime. They provide the box lunches.
All right,
So you can
so
register.
lunch, you'll be with some good people and you'll hear a really intensive conversation, get a lot of information about the issue we're talking about tonight, but also
Mhm.
about the issues for trans people.
And so I want to mention prochoicenc.org is the NARAL NC website. And so we have a lot of good information there
Do
about
it again.
prochoicenc.org.
You got that?
And then we have, of course, Facebook, and Instagram and Twitter. Please follow us on social media. I do also want to mention, we work closely with the Carolina Abortion Fund, which does funding for direct services so people can access abortion. They are extremely busy. They provide funding services for North Carolina and South Carolina. We also work closely with the clinic escorts who are providing volunteers. They're not engaging with protesters. They are just there to help the patients be able to feel safe and comfortable going in and out of the clinic.
And where will
what
we
is
get
that
this?
group again?
Well, there's different clinic escorts. They're associated with different clinics.
Oh,
So, and I can always share, like, there's like the Triangle Clinic escorts, there's a Triad group,
Oh.
Greensboro group. Yeah, there's Charlotte
And
group.
where are
Escorts,
people-
we're
Yeah.
talking about
people
escorts,
gonna
Yeah.
find-
okay.
Where are people gonna find this information, on your website
That's,
Facebook? or both?
maybe I can send you the link. So, I mean, because they usually have like their own Facebook groups.
But
Yeah.
just NARAL's
Yeah.
calendar of events,
Yeah.
would that be on NARAL.org?
Well, we can do prochoicenc.org. I think
Oh,
we
pro-choice.
definitely, yeah, I'm trying to think of how we best, like, where on our website we have information
Well,
about
we can just
pro-choice.
go to that for more information. Our time is running
We
out.
have one announcement,
And- What?
We have an announcement.
We'll make it quick because we're saying goodbye.
I just wanna let you, or our listeners know that Nina Turner, who is Bernie Sanders' campaign co-chair, is coming to Chapel Hill, 2:30 on Saturday at Extraordinary Ventures. And if you wanna bring this discussion to that exciting venue,
So
do so.
2:30 Saturday at
2:30
Extraordinary
Saturday at
Ventures.
Extraordinary Ventures. If you have
About
not
Bernie
heard,
Sanders.
Nina Turner.
Nina Turner. Thank you,
You need to go.
Mira. So we've had Tara Romano as our guest, and we're talking about women's reproductive rights, particularly about the war on women, about abortion, and many other parts of women's bodies that are always being fought over. And also Miriam Thompson, a Wilf sister. So thank you both for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're here every Wednesday, and we're gonna be on YouTube in a few days for this show and others. And then next week, this will be on the People's Channel.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Native.
That was fun.
Better than